The coldest night of the year, and Grant Mercer stood in the brightly lit doorway, watching the security guard throw his wife's suitcase into the snow. Evelyn Hart, 8 months pregnant, barefoot on the icy pavement, didn't cry. She just stared straight into the face of the man who had sworn to love her and saw nothing there anymore. The Illinois blizzard devoured the road ahead. Her phone was dead. Her strength was depleted. She fell into the snow, believing this was the end for her and her unborn child. Then the black armored SUVs tore through the white curtain. The one who emerged wasn't a savior. Roman Vescari, Chicago's most feared crime boss, didn't save people. He wasn't in the habit of doing so. But tonight, for reasons even he didn't understand, he stopped. If you want to know what happens next, please like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. The cold had a personality in Illinois. It didn't just sit on the skin, it worked its way through layers, through wool and cotton and whatever stubborn warmth the body tried to hold on to, until it found the soft parts underneath and started pressing. Evelyn had lived in this state for 6 years, and she had never felt it like this. Not like tonight. She had made it maybe 200 yards from the gate before her legs started failing her. The suitcase was somewhere behind her, half buried already by the time she'd stopped dragging it. One of the wheels had cracked on the frozen asphalt, and she'd left it there, in the dark, because there was no point carrying something that wouldn't roll, and she had very little left to carry anything with. 8 months of pregnancy had redistributed her entire body. Her lower back had been screaming for 3 weeks. Her feet had stopped being fully hers somewhere around month 7. And now, in the worst blizzard Illinois had produced in 11 years, she was standing in the middle of a private road that led nowhere useful, wearing the coat she'd managed to grab off the hook by the service entrance before Marcus, Grant's head of security, 6'4" and expressionless as a block of cement, had taken her by the elbow and walked her out. She had not been violent. She had not screamed. She had asked very quietly if she could call someone first. Marcus had said no. Grant had said nothing at all. He'd stood in the doorway of the house she'd spent 2 years helping design, and he'd watched with his arms crossed and his jaw set. And when she'd looked back at him from the driveway, she'd searched his face for something, regret, doubt, even the performance of it, and found nothing, not even discomfort, just a man closing a chapter. She didn't know what she'd done wrong. That was the worst part. She had been sitting in the upstairs library reading when Marcus had knocked, and 3 minutes later she was outside with her coat and one suitcase and no phone charger and no explanation beyond Grant's voice through the intercom, flat and final. "You know what you did, Evelyn." She didn't. She still didn't. The road curved ahead of her and disappeared into white. The streetlights along the property's edge ended at the gate, and beyond that there was nothing. No houses, no gas stations, no lights from any direction. The nearest town was 11 miles east. She had looked it up once, absently, the way you memorize irrelevant things about a place you assume you'll leave on your own terms someday. 11 miles. She put one foot in front of the other. Her phone had died 20 minutes into walking. She'd been trying to call her sister, Diane, who lived in Evanston and would have come without questions, but the battery had been low since morning and the cold finished it off, and now it was just a rectangle of cold glass in her coat pocket that she kept checking out of reflex. The snow was coming sideways now. She couldn't feel her left hand anymore. She thought about the baby. She did that constantly, a kind of involuntary accounting, checking in, registering weight and movement and warmth. The baby moved. She pressed her palm against her coat, through the wool, and felt the shift of something small and alive pushing back. "Still here, still here." She said it out loud, or tried to. The wind took it. She had gone maybe another 50 yards when her right foot caught on something, a ridge of ice under the snow, a crack in the asphalt, she never knew which, and she went down. Not a stumble, a full fall, one knee first and then both palms, and she twisted as she went, training taking over, landing on her side instead of her stomach, and she lay there in the snow with her cheek against the ground and her breath coming in short gasps that the cold turned to steam and the wind scattered. Get up. She knew she needed to get up. She also knew, with the particular clarity that comes when the body begins to fail, that getting up was going to take something she wasn't sure she had. Her hands were shaking when she pushed against the ground. Her arms wouldn't lock. The baby shifted again, and the movement sent a spike of something through her lower abdomen. Not a contraction, not yet, just a warning, the body saying, "Pay attention." She got to her knees. That much she managed. She was still trying to get further than that when the lights appeared. They came from behind her, from the direction of the Mercer property, and her first thought was Grant, that he'd changed his mind, that Marcus was coming back with the car, that there had been some mistake or some mercy she hadn't expected. She turned, squinting against the snow and the light, and counted the headlights. Too many. 4 pairs. 5. All high and wide, the kind of spacing you got from large vehicles running close together. Not Grant's fleet. Grant drove German sedans, dark gray, low to the road. These were SUVs. Massive, black, moving through the blizzard with a steadiness that suggested weight and power she couldn't quite calculate. They slowed before they reached her. She watched them from her knees on the road, one hand pressed against her stomach, and she thought clearly and without panic, "I don't know what this is." The convoy stopped. For a moment, nothing. Just the wind and the engines and the snow coming down between them. Then the rear door of the second vehicle opened. The man who stepped out was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, built without excess in either direction. Not large, not slight, just someone who had spent a long time being exactly as big as he needed to be. Dark coat, no hat. He stood in the blizzard like the cold was an inconvenience he'd already declined to acknowledge, and he looked at her on the ground in front of him with an expression she couldn't read. Not surprise, not warmth, not calculation. Something more like assessment. The way a man looks at a problem he hasn't decided to solve yet. He said, "Can you stand?" His voice was low and even and carried through the storm without effort. Evelyn said, "I'm working on it." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, just a recalibration. He looked back at the vehicle, said something to someone inside she couldn't hear, then looked at her again. "How far along?" 8 months? He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he walked forward, stopped just outside arm's reach, and crouched down to her level. Up close, he had dark eyes and a scar along the left side of his jaw that looked old and deliberate, and she thought very briefly about what kind of life left marks like that. "Roman Viscaris," he said, like it meant something. She knew the name. Anyone who'd spent time in Chicago society knew the name, though it was the kind of knowing that happened through whispers and the deliberate avoidance of full sentences at dinner parties. She had heard it once from Grant, who'd said, with the particular emphasis men use when they want something to sound like warning but feel like awe, "That's not a man you do business with." She said, "Evelyn Hart." "Hart," he repeated, and something went quiet behind his eyes. "Not Mercer?" "Not tonight," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The snow built up on his shoulders, and he didn't move to brush it off. Then he stood and turned back toward the SUV. "Bring her in," he said to someone she couldn't see. She wanted to say she didn't need help. She was halfway through forming the sentence when 2 men appeared from the vehicle, and she realized her legs were shaking too hard to make the argument convincing, and she let them help her up without saying anything. The inside of the SUV was warm. It hit her all at once, the heat, the leather, the absence of wind, and her body reacted before her mind could, a shudder moving through her that she couldn't stop. She sat in the back seat with her hands pressed between her thighs and tried to breathe steadily while the convoy started moving again. Roman sat across from her, watching the road through the window. Nobody spoke. After a few minutes, he said without looking at her, "Were you walking to town?" "Trying. 11 miles. I know the distance." He looked at her then. "In a blizzard, 8 months pregnant." "I'm aware of my situation." His jaw tightened, barely. "Why were you on Mercer's Road?" She thought about how to answer that. "I lived there," she said finally. Past tense. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. She said, "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere warm." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She wanted to push harder. The part of her that had managed law school on partial scholarship and clerked for a federal judge at 26 years old and had never in her life accepted a non-answer from anyone, was already forming the follow-up questions. But the baby shifted, and her lower back sent up another flare. And she was so tired, in a way that went beyond sleep deprivation into something structural, something that felt like the last 48 hours had been filed down to the wire. She leaned her head against the window and watched the storm and said nothing. She was asleep before she understood she was falling asleep. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, set back from a private road behind a gate that opened without the convoy slowing. Evelyn woke when the vehicle stopped, her neck aching from the angle, and looked out at a large stone house with lights in every window and two men at the front door who were very clearly not there to welcome guests. She was helped inside before she could fully orient herself. The inside of the house was not what she'd imagined from the exterior. She'd expected something that announced itself, the kind of interior that existed to communicate power to visitors, marble and gold, and the particular aggressive elegance of men who had something to prove. Instead, it was spare and warm, dark wood, and heavy furniture in rooms that looked like they were actually used. Books on real shelves, a fireplace with real ash in it. A woman appeared from a hallway, mid-50s, short gray hair, the brisk efficiency of someone who managed things for a living and had no interest in being thanked for it. She looked at Evelyn with the same absence of drama. "I'm Carla," she said. "I'll take you to the room. Are you having any contractions?" "No." "Pain?" "My back. It's been bad." "I'll get the heating pad. You need to eat something?" Evelyn realized she hadn't eaten since noon. "Yes." "Come on then." She followed Carla up a staircase without looking back at Roman, who had stopped in the entry and was speaking quietly on a phone, his back to both of them. The room was plain and clean, with a bed that looked like it would actually hold her weight without comment, which at this point in the pregnancy was not something she took for granted. Carla brought soup and bread and the heating pad and left without fuss, and Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and ate slowly and looked at the wall and tried to think. She had approximately nothing, no phone, no charger, no wallet. She'd left her purse in the library when Marcus came for her, and she hadn't thought clearly enough in those 3 minutes to go back for it. No identification, no way to contact Diane or anyone else. She was in a house belonging to a man whose name was spoken in Chicago the way you spoke about weather systems, with a certain respectful dread, and she had gotten into his car in the middle of a blizzard because the alternative was dying on the road with her unborn daughter. She pressed her hand against her stomach. Still here, she needed a phone. She needed to get a message to Diane. She needed to think through what Grant's accusation had even been, because you know what you did was not an accusation. It was a performance of one. And somewhere between the shock and the cold and the fall, she hadn't let herself sit with the strangeness of it. She hadn't done anything. She tried to reverse engineer the last 2 weeks, looking for something she'd missed, a conversation that might have been overheard wrong, a message that might have read sideways. She'd been home mostly. The last 2 months the pregnancy had slowed her down enough that her trips to the city had become rare. She had met with her family's estate attorney once, about the inheritance schedule. She had gone to her last OB appointment with Diane because Grant had been traveling. She stopped. The inheritance. Her grandmother's estate, Catherine Hart's trust, structured before Evelyn was born, had a clause she'd grown up hearing about without fully understanding until the attorney explained it 3 years ago. The inheritance transferred on 2 conditions: Evelyn's 28th birthday, which had passed, and the birth of a legal heir. Both conditions would be met for the first time within weeks. The number the attorney had described was large enough that Evelyn had asked him to repeat it. She had mentioned the meeting to Grant afterward. Just mentioned it, the way you mention things to a husband. He'd been attentive, interested, asked questions. She sat on the bed in Roman Viscari's safe house and thought about the look on Grant's face in the doorway and how long it had been since it looked like love and how much it had looked, tonight, like math. She was still thinking when the knock came. Roman didn't wait long after knocking. He opened the door and stood in the frame, looking at her the way he'd looked at her on the road, assessing, without pretense of anything warmer. "Feeling better?" "Relatively." He looked at the empty bowl. "Good." He came in a few steps and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, and the posture was casual, but nothing about his eyes was casual. "I need you to tell me what happened tonight. Everything." She looked at him. "Why?" Because you were on a road that connects to 3 properties, he said. Mine is one of them. She understood then that this wasn't charity, or not only charity. She was sitting in his house and she'd been found on a road that touched his operation, and a man like Roman Vescari didn't stop for strangers without accounting for what the stranger cost him. You ran a check on me, she said, while you were sleeping, yes. She didn't find this surprising. And? And your husband moved $40 million across 3 accounts in the last 6 months, he said, and the trail ends somewhere it shouldn't. The number landed in her chest like something dropped from height. That's not possible, she said. Our accounts? Not your accounts. He watched her absorb this. Older money. Trust you didn't know to look at. Her grandmother's estate. The inheritance. She felt the room tilt slightly and pressed both feet flat on the floor and breathed. How do you have access to that information? She asked. I have access to most things, he said. That's not the point. What is the point? He was quiet for a moment. Then, the point is that whatever Grant Mercer told you tonight, the real reason he put you on that road is because you're worth more to him dead than divorced. The inheritance transfers to your daughter when she's born. If something happened to both of you before then, stop, she said. He stopped. She sat very still with her hand on her stomach and the heating pad warm against her back and the storm still loud against the windows. And she thought about Grant watching her walk away, and the patience in his face, and the math of it, and how she had spent 2 years in a house that had been designed, maybe always, as a place to contain her until the timing was right. My daughter, she said. He would have... I don't know what he would have done, Roman said. I know what the money suggests. She looked at him. He looked back. There was something in his face she didn't expect. Not pity, she didn't think he was built for pity, but something close to its functional edge. The acknowledgement of a wrong that couldn't be corrected by ignoring it. I'm not going to send you back, he said. That's not what this is. I didn't think it was. But I need to know everything. The inheritance, the accounts, anyone who knew about the trust. Every name. She understood what he was asking. He was pulling her into something. She knew enough about men like Roman Vescari to know that accepting help from them was a transaction with a long tail, that it didn't come clean, that she would owe him in ways neither of them could fully articulate yet. She also understood that she was 8 months pregnant, sitting in a stranger's safe house, with no phone and no money, and a husband who had apparently decided she was cheaper eliminated than divorced. She said, There's an attorney, family name Duncan Hale. He knows the full structure of the trust. He's the one who explained the clause to me. Roman nodded. Something shifted in his posture. Not visible tension, but the kind of attention that comes when a problem has just become actionable. I'll have someone reach him tonight. It's midnight. He'll answer. She believed that. She believed it the way you believe things about men who have spent their entire lives ensuring that certain doors opened for them regardless of the hour. He pushed off from the wall and moved toward the door, then stopped, looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. She wanted to ask what kind of complicated. She wanted to know what his people had found in those accounts, what the trail looked like, whether the attorney was safe. She had 15 questions lined up behind her teeth. She asked none of them. Not because she was afraid of the answers, but because she was watching his face and she saw something she hadn't clocked until now. Something quick and then gone. A look at her stomach, the briefest, most controlled thing, and she understood that whatever Roman Vescari had told himself about why he'd stopped on that road tonight, the answer was not entirely strategic. He left. She lay back on the bed, one hand on her daughter, and listened to the storm outside and the low voices in the corridor below and the sounds of a house that was never fully at rest. Her mind kept moving even as her body tried to quit. $40 million. 6 months of movement. 3 accounts she'd never known to look for. Someone had spent a long time preparing this. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't anger. It was architecture, patient, detailed. The work of people who had calculated exactly how much time they had before the inheritance became legally untouchable. Who else knew? Grant didn't have this kind of financial sophistication. She knew his limits, had known them for years, had quietly managed the parts of their joint finances that required actual precision while he managed the image of it. Someone had helped him build this. Someone older, with deeper reach, with the kind of connections that could move that much money without leaving obvious tracks. She was still pulling at that thread when sleep took her again. She didn't hear the 3 black SUVs arrive at the estate at 2 in the morning. She didn't hear Roman's voice in the courtyard, low and cutting, asking questions that no one answered fast enough. She didn't hear the name his investigators said, the name that changed the shape of everything, that turned a domestic crime into something older and larger and far more dangerous than a man who wanted his wife's inheritance. Victor Mercer, Grant's father. The man who had built the Mercer fortune from scratch 30 years ago and had never, not once, allowed anyone to look closely at Hal. She was asleep when Roman stood in the cold courtyard and understood, for the first time since he'd stopped on that road, exactly what he had driven into the middle of. And she was asleep when he looked up at the window of the room where she was sleeping and made a decision that had nothing to do with money or territory or the long calculations of men in his position. He went back inside. He posted 2 men at her door, and outside the gate, somewhere in the dark beyond the storm's edge, a vehicle sat with its lights off and its engine running, and the man inside it lifted a phone and said, very quietly, that the woman had been found. She woke to voices. Not loud. The house had a discipline to it, the sounds kept low and purposeful, but enough to pull her up from the shallow place she'd been sleeping, the kind of sleep that isn't really rest but is the closest the body can manage when it doesn't feel safe. She lay still for a moment, hand flat against her stomach, running the inventory. Baby present, back pain unchanged, room unfamiliar but warm. Outside the window, the storm was quieter than it had been, still moving but losing its fury. The wind coming in longer intervals instead of the constant battering she'd fallen asleep to. The voices were in the corridor, male, 2 of them, speaking in a register too low to parse words but with a tension in the rhythm that she recognized. Not conversation, not reporting. Argument with the volume suppressed. She sat up slowly, getting her weight distributed before she tried to stand, which had been the only way to manage it for the last 6 weeks. Her back protested in its particular grinding way. She got to her feet, found the wall with one hand, and crossed to the door. She opened it. The 2 men posted outside, different men than the ones who'd helped her from the SUV, these ones younger and holding themselves with the particular stillness of people trained not to fidget, looked at her without expression. "I need water," she said, "and I need to know what's happening." Neither of them moved. "Water I can get you," one said. "And the other part?" A pause. "Mr. Viscari's downstairs." She took that as directional information rather than a dismissal and moved toward the staircase. Neither man stopped her. The house below was lit and occupied in a way it hadn't been when Carla walked her upstairs. 3 men she hadn't seen sat at a long table in what appeared to be a dining room being used as a workspace, laptops open, papers spread, someone on a phone speaking in shorthand she couldn't follow. Another man stood by the front window looking out at the gate with the focused patience of someone who had done that for a living long enough that it no longer required thought. Roman was in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with a coffee cup and a phone and a printed document she recognized as the kind that came from financial databases. Columnar, dense, the formatting of systems that don't care about readability. He was reading it with the kind of attention that didn't register her immediately. Then it did. "You should be sleeping," he said, without looking up. "I heard arguing." "You heard Petrov disagreeing with Kaz about a perimeter call. It wasn't relevant to you." "Everything in this house is relevant to me right now." She moved to the counter across from him and leaned against it. "You told me tonight would be complicated." "I told you tomorrow would be complicated." "It's almost 4 in the morning." He set the document down. Looked at her fully for the first time since she'd walked in. He'd shed the coat, rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and looked less like a man who'd been found in a blizzard, and more like a man who hadn't slept because he hadn't wanted to, not because he couldn't. "Hale is dead," he said. She heard the words in the right order and still needed a second to sort them. Duncan Hale. "We sent 2 men to his house at 1 a.m. The police were already there. They're calling it a break-in. Whoever did it was fast and left very little." He watched her take this in. His home office was the only room that was touched, The trust documents, she said. The originals would have been there. Copies in a firm's server. We're working on accessing that now. Working on accessing, she repeated. Yes. That's not legal. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but something in the same neighborhood. No, he said. It isn't. She pressed her back against the counter and crossed her arms, which was harder to do than it used to be. The geometry of it changed by the pregnancy, and she hated that even now she was aware of that. He was a good man, she said. Duncan Hale. He sent my grandmother flowers every year on her birthday after she died. Out of habit. Roman said nothing. How long ago did they know I'd met with him? That's the question. He picked up the document again, not to read it, just to have something in his hands, she thought. The account movement started 8 months ago, which means this was in planning before your last meeting with Hale. 8 months. The same number of months she'd been pregnant. She stood very still and let that alignment settle. They've been running this since before she was born, she said. Since before anyone outside your marriage knew you were pregnant, he said, which suggests someone inside told them. She went through the list automatically, the way she'd done on the road without getting far. Her OB, Diane. The housekeeper, a woman named Petra who had been with the Mercer household for 12 years and who Evelyn had never had any reason to distrust. Grant himself, obviously. Petra, she said, and hated saying it. Roman looked at her. The housekeeper. She's worked for Victor Mercer since Grant was a teenager. I always thought she was just someone who stayed. She stopped. I was wrong about that. We're already looking at her. You have a file on the housekeeper. We have files on everyone in the Mercer household. We've had them for 18 months. She studied him. Why? His jaw moved, deciding how much. Victor Mercer and I have overlapping interests in the city. Have for a long time. Watching his people is something my organization does as a matter of practice. Overlapping interests? She said. What does that mean? It means we compete, and competition requires information. So you knew about Grant. I knew Grant Mercer was moving money, he said. I didn't know it was connected to you until tonight. She believed him, mostly. There was something in the way he delivered information, spare, without cushion, that she found easier to trust than Grant's careful emotional language, the warmth Grant had deployed like a tool for years before she'd understood that warmth could be tactical. Victor's behind this, she said. Not Grant. Grant doesn't have the architecture for something this large. No, Roman agreed. He doesn't. Grant is the front. Victor built it. Yes. She thought about Victor Mercer. She had met him 11 times over 6 years of marriage. She knew the number because each meeting had been a small endurance, the kind of social interaction that required a certain active management. Victor was polite with the particular deliberateness of a man who considered politeness a concession. He was 71 years old and had built a legitimate-looking empire over 4 decades that sat on top of something she had never been able to identify but had always sensed, the way you sense a draft from a wall with no visible gap. He had never liked her. She'd thought it was because she wasn't the kind of woman he'd wanted for his son. She understood now that it was because she was the kind of woman who asked questions and retained the answers. What's in the Mercer money, she said. Underneath. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Fraud, he said. Structural. A real estate scheme that's been running since 1991. Municipal contracts, redirected federal funds, shell companies folded into legitimate holdings. There are people in this city who lost everything to it. Pension funds, small developers. He said it flat, without performance. Victor Mercer has been the center of it for 30 years, and he has survived every federal probe that's come close by staying one name removed from every transaction. And my grandmother's trust. Is one of the pools the money flows through. She didn't know. The structure was set up through a firm Victor had relationships with. The attorney before Hale. He paused. That attorney died 4 years ago. Natural causes. She felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. How long have you known this? About the fraud? Long enough. About your family trust being part of it? 3 hours. She pulled in a breath. Let it out. If my daughter is born and the inheritance transfers, it exposes the whole channel, he said. The legitimacy of the transfer would trigger regulatory review of the trust's history. Victor's been preparing for that for a year. The goal was never the inheritance money. The goal was eliminating the event that causes the review. Eliminating the event. She and her daughter. She said, "I need to sit down." He pulled a chair from the kitchen table without comment, and she sat and put both hands flat on the table and breathed. And he didn't say anything useful or comforting, which she appreciated more than she could explain. After a moment, she said, "He's going to send someone here." "He already has," Roman said. "Vehicle outside the east gate. We spotted it 40 minutes ago." Her head came up. "And you didn't—" "We're watching it. I want to know who they are before I move on them." "That's a choice that has consequences for the people in this house." His eyes didn't change. "I'm aware of what's in this house." She held his gaze. There was something in that sentence she didn't push on. "I need a phone," she said. "I need to call my sister." "Not yet." "She doesn't know where I am." "Which means she can't tell anyone about him," he said. "Including by accident. Give me until morning." She wanted to fight it. The part of her that had been autonomous her entire adult life, that had never depended on anyone's timetable but her own, sat up and sharpened. But she thought about Diane. Warm, careless Diane, who loved her without filter, and who would answer the phone at 4 a.m. and would say her name loud enough that the person on the next call could hear. And she understood the logic even while hating it. "Morning," she said. He nodded. She stayed at the table. He stayed at the counter. The house moved around them with its low, purposeful activity, and outside the storm continued its slow retreat, and somewhere beyond the east gate a car sat in the dark with its engine running, and they both knew what that meant. The knock came just after 6. Not from outside. From inside, one of his men, the one who'd been on the phone when she came downstairs. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his laptop at an angle and said, "Got into the firm server." Roman set his cup down. "How much is there?" he asked. "Enough." The man looked briefly at Evelyn, a professional assessment with no hostility, then back to Roman. "There's also a secondary document Hale filed 3 weeks ago. Notarized, he flagged the trust structure as potentially irregular and sent a copy to a federal financial crimes unit." The room was very quiet. "He knew," Evelyn said. "He suspected," Roman said, "which is different, except when someone kills you for it." She thought about Duncan Hale sending her grandmother flowers every year out of habit, and the way he'd sat across from her at his desk and explained the inheritance with a precision that had seemed at the time like professional care, and wondered how long he'd been sitting with what he suspected. "Who did he send it to?" Roman asked. The man pulled up something on his screen. "Agent Camille Rhodes, Financial Crimes, Chicago Field Office." Roman went still in a specific way she was starting to recognize. Not frozen, just recalibrating fast with very little visible indication of the speed. "Rhodes," he said. "You know her?" Evelyn asked. "She's been building a case against Victor Mercer for 2 years. He said it to the room more than to her. "She's been hitting walls. No documents with his name on them. Every source that gets close goes quiet. Now she has Hale's filing," Evelyn said. "Now she has a dead attorney and Hale's filing and probably a phone record of who he met with in the weeks before he died." He looked at her directly. "She's going to want to talk to you." "I want to talk to her." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because the minute you surface as a federal witness, Victor Mercer will know exactly where you are, and the men outside the gate will be the least of our problems." He crossed his arms. The sleeves were still rolled up, and she could see the tension in his forearms, a controlled physical energy that had nowhere to go. "We need to control when and how you appear. We need to be ready before that happens." "And what does ready look like for you?" she asked. His eyes moved over her face. "It looks like building a case that doesn't need you on the front line to succeed." "She's already involved," the man in the doorway said. They both looked at him. He turned the laptop screen toward them. The document on the screen was a photograph, time-stamped from 2 hours ago, a photograph of the East Gate. And in the margin of the image, a notation in the kind of shorthand used by surveillance teams. A name. Grant Mercer. Not Victor. Grant himself was in the car at the East Gate. Evelyn stared at the screen and felt something she hadn't let herself feel yet. Not fear, she had been afraid steadily for hours, and it had become background noise. This was different. This was the particular devastation of understanding that the man she had chosen, the man she had slept next to for 6 years, and had talked to about names for their daughter, and had stood beside in the kitchen on ordinary mornings, had driven through a blizzard to make sure the job was finished, not to take her back, to make sure she was gone. "He came himself," she said. Nobody answered. She looked at Roman. His face had gone somewhere hard and specific, and the look in his eyes was not one she associated with mercy. "I want him brought in," she said. "No. He's my husband. He came to— I know what he came to do." Roman's voice was even and final. "You're not going near him. You don't get to make that decision. While you're in my house carrying a child that 2 men are willing to commit murder to prevent from being born," he said. "Yes, I do." She stood up. He didn't step back. They were close enough that she could see the old scar on his jaw clearly, the way it pulled slightly when he clenched his teeth, which he was doing now. She was shaking, she realized. Not from cold. "He put me on that road," she said. 8 months pregnant. In a blizzard. "I know. He was going to let me die." "I know. And you're telling me to stay in this room while he sits 60 yards away and— Evelyn." He said her name with a quietness that stopped her. Not gentle, just exact, like he was placing a hand on a moving thing to slow it down. "If we bring him in now, Victor knows within an hour. Everything we have, the filing, the server documents, whatever Rhodes has been building, we lose the timing. We lose the element that can actually end this." She breathed through her nose. Her hands were still shaking. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm going to let him sit there," he said, "and I'm going to make a call." "To who?" "Someone Victor trusts. Who doesn't trust Victor anymore." He turned to the man in the doorway. "Get me Celine." The man's expression didn't change, but there was something in the shift of his shoulders that she read as surprise, quickly suppressed. "You sure?" "Get her," Roman said. The man left. Evelyn stood in the kitchen in the early gray light beginning to push at the windows, and thought about all the things she didn't know. Who Celine was, what leverage Roman thought he had, how many ways this could go wrong, and underneath all of that, like a metronome she couldn't turn off, the steady pressure of her daughter moving against her palm. Still here. She had to keep her here. "Sit down," Roman said. "Eat something. It's going to be a long day." She didn't sit, but she stopped shaking. That was something. From the front of the house, muffled by walls and distance, came the sound of a car door. Not opening, closing. Grant was moving. Roman was already out of the kitchen before she could speak, and the 2 men who'd been at the front window were moving toward the door, and the house that had been running on low, purposeful tension suddenly shifted into something faster and more dangerous, the quality of the air changing the way it changes in the seconds before lightning. And she stood at the kitchen counter with her hand flat against her stomach and heard, from somewhere outside, the unmistakable crunch of tires on snow, and then the first shot. The shot came from the east. Not from Grant's car. From somewhere past the gate. From the tree line that edged the property on that side, and the sound of it was flat and hard in the cold air, the way gunshots always were in open space. Nothing like what movies suggested, just a sharp crack that the morning swallowed almost immediately. Then another. Then the kind of sustained fire that meant more than one shooter and a level of coordination that didn't belong to a man sitting alone in a car outside a gate. Grant hadn't come alone. Roman was already through the front door by the time Evelyn processed this, moving with a speed and economy that had nothing performative in it, just a body that had been trained for exactly this kind of transition and made it without visible effort. She heard him say 2 words to the men on the porch, words she didn't catch. And then the house became organized chaos, people moving with purpose, nobody running but everyone fast, the specific controlled urgency of a unit that had drilled for this. Carla appeared from somewhere and put a hand on Evelyn's arm. "Back room," she said. "What's happening?" "Back room, now." She let herself be moved. That was the calculation she made in the 3 seconds she had to make it. That she was 8 months pregnant and had no weapon and no tactical training, and the most useful thing she could do for her daughter was get away from the windows. Carla took her down a hallway and through a door into a room she hadn't seen before. A narrow space with no exterior windows, shelving on 2 walls, a cot in the corner that suggested this room had been used for exactly this purpose before. She sat on the cot. Carla stood by the door with her arms crossed and her face doing nothing at all. Outside, the shooting continued in irregular bursts. Evelyn counted shooters the way her mind had started doing everything since last night, automatically, looking for structure in chaos. At least 3 positions. The return fire from Roman's men was more concentrated, controlled. She heard shouting, then an engine, then silence from one direction that might have been a vehicle disabled or a position abandoned. Her daughter moved. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way the OB had taught her for labor preparation, and thought about how none of those preparation classes had covered this particular scenario. The shooting stopped. The silence after it had a texture, thick and listening, the whole property holding its breath. Then voices, closer, and footsteps on the porch, and she exhaled. Carla went to the door, cracked it, listened, then opened it fully. "Okay," she said. Roman came to the hallway 2 minutes later. He had blood on the left side of his jaw. Not his, she thought. The angle was wrong for his own wound, and he was moving normally, which she'd already started reading as the baseline signal for undamaged. He looked at her on the cot and did the same rapid assessment she'd seen him do twice before. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. "What happened?" 4 men from the tree line. Grant's car is gone. He was gone before the first shot, which means he wasn't running the team. He was signaling them. He came to confirm I was here, and to clear out before it got loud. Something moved across Roman's face, a darkness she was starting to recognize as the specific anger he kept away from his voice and let live in his expression instead. They knew the layout of the east perimeter. They had a window and they used it. "Petra," Evelyn said. "Petra," he confirmed. She thought about the woman who had brought her tea without being asked every morning for 2 years in the Mercer house, who had knocked before entering every room, who had spoken to her with a deference that Evelyn had read as personality and was apparently something else entirely. "Were any of your men—" Kaz took one in the shoulder. "He'll keep the arm." Roman looked at Carla. "Get him to the facility. Don't use the east road." Carla left. Roman stayed in the hallway doorway with his hands at his sides and his jaw tight and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of which she had a clean word for. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it before I make the call to Celine." She waited. Victor Mercer isn't just connected to the fraud. He built the system that the fraud runs through, and that system has dependencies, so people across the city who benefit from it and who will act to protect it. That includes people in the federal building. She went still. "You're saying someone inside the Chicago field office. I'm saying I don't know who Rhodes talks to, and I don't know who talks to Victor. What I know is that the moment your name appears in a federal file as a living witness, it gets seen by people I can't predict." He paused. "Hale filed his report 3 weeks ago and was dead before we found out about it. The timing matters." She understood what he was saying. "You think someone in the investigation tipped Victor?" "I think it's possible, which means Rhodes may not be safe to contact through official channels." Evelyn sat with that. The cot was firm beneath her and the room smelled faintly of dust and something chemical, like old cleaning supplies, and she was acutely aware of the smallness of the space and the largeness of what was assembling itself outside it. "Who is Celine?" she asked. Roman was quiet for a moment in the specific way he was quiet when he was deciding on the boundaries of an answer. "She worked for Victor for 11 years, he said. "She ran the financial architecture. She knows where every account is, every shell company, every name on every board that shouldn't be there." "She left?" 18 months ago, quietly. Victor doesn't know what she took when she left." "What did she take?" "Everything," he said. "Every record from 1991 forward, structured, organized, cross-referenced, a complete case. She's been sitting on it because she had no way to guarantee her own safety if she moved on it. Evelyn looked at him. But now she does. He met her eyes. If I'm the one offering the guarantee. Yes. She turned this over. Why haven't you used her before? If she has everything on Victor. Because using Celine means opening a door I can't close. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. She knows things about more than Victor. Our organizations have overlapped for 20 years. There are things on those records that... He stopped, chose the next words carefully. This has a cost for me. I want you to know that. She did know it. She looked at him in the doorway of a windowless room in a house full of armed men and tried to read what it cost a man like Roman Vescari to say something like that out loud, to name a vulnerability directly rather than engineering around it, and decided it cost him more than he'd admit. Make the call, she said. He nodded once and left. She sat on the cot for another hour. Nobody came except one of the younger men who brought her water and crackers and left without making conversation. She ate the crackers and drank the water and ran through everything she knew in the order she knew it and tried to find the pieces she was still missing. There were more than she'd like. The sound of a vehicle arriving at just after 9 a.m. was different from the convoy sounds she'd been calibrating to. Smaller, single, coming fast down the main road without the measured spacing of Roman's fleet. She heard voices at the front door, one of them a woman's, clipped and precise. Not warmth, but not aggression either. Celine was not what she'd constructed in her head. She was perhaps 50, built lean, with a face that had learned to give very little away through practice rather than nature. She wore clothes that were expensive and completely without decoration, the style of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where she needed to be taken seriously on first sight and had engineered her appearance accordingly. She looked at Evelyn across the main room of the house with a gaze that was quick and cataloging and moved on. She was looking at Roman. "You look tired," she said to him. "Long night." "I heard the shooting on the scanner." She set a bag on the table, leather, heavy, the kind with a combination lock on the zipper. "They're escalating." "They lost the window," Roman said. "Victor will move faster now." Celine looked at Evelyn again, more fully this time. "You're the heart woman." "Evelyn," she said, "the inheritance triggers at birth." "Yes." "When?" "Estimated 3 weeks. Could be sooner." Celine's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it. She looked at Roman. 3 weeks is not a lot of room." "No," he said, "it isn't. That's why I called you." A long pause. Celine put her hand on the bag, but didn't open it. "You understand what opening this means." "I understand. For both of us." "Yes." She studied him for another moment, and Evelyn watched the exchange between them with the particular attention she paid to things people communicated without using words. The history in it, the specific weight of two people who had known each other long enough to have accumulated debts that didn't have clean names. Then Celine opened the bag. The documents inside were organized with a precision that was almost physical in its intensity. Tabbed, dated, cross-referenced. The work of someone who had spent years waiting for the moment they'd be needed and had refused to let them be anything less than perfect in the meantime. She laid 3 folders on the table. "The fraud structure," she said. 30 years. Every shell company, every redirect, every municipal official who signed off on a contract they shouldn't have signed. 42 names. She laid a hand on the first folder. Victor Mercer is the center. He's connected to every one of them, but his name appears nowhere in the direct chain. That's the architecture. He built it so that if any one piece collapsed, the collapse would stop before it reached him. "But the trust," Evelyn said. Celine looked at her. "The Heart Trust is different. It's the one channel where Victor had to use real names because it was built on a legitimate estate structure. He couldn't fully anonymize it without triggering the review he was trying to avoid." She opened the second folder. The money that moved through Catherine Hart's estate over 20 years, routed, redirected, laundered through transactions that looked like standard trust management. Evelyn's share of the inheritance, when it transfers, will carry a provenance that any competent forensic accountant can trace back to 1998. She was talking about Evelyn's grandmother's money. Her grandmother's money. Evelyn looked at the papers and thought about Catherine Hart, who had been a school teacher and a careful woman, and who had built the trust out of decades of saving and a piece of land her own father had left her, and who had died believing she was leaving something clean behind. She didn't know, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. No, Celine said, simply, without cruelty. The structure was placed before she could have known to look for it. The attorney Victor used, William Crane, was thorough. He knew what he was doing, and he did it invisibly. And Crane, dead, 2019, as Roman told you. She nodded. She kept her face still and her breathing even and her hands flat on the table in front of her because the alternative was something she didn't have room for right now. What does Victor do when he finds out you're here? Roman asked Celine. He already knows, she said. The room changed. Roman went very still. What? I was followed from my apartment. I lost the tail on the 90, but they had a second car I didn't spot until I was already on your access road. She said it without apology, which Evelyn recognized as the response of someone who had made a professional error and wasn't going to waste time on performance. I'm sorry. It was a two-team setup. I haven't seen that kind of resource deployment from Victor before. Roman turned away from the table, just slightly, just enough that Evelyn saw the breath he took and controlled before he turned back. How long ago? He said. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Evelyn did the math without wanting to. Whatever Victor had been assembling since the East Gate shooting, whatever response he'd been mobilizing, he now had a location confirmed, not just the property, confirmed by sight. We need to move, Roman said to the room. The room was already moving. Men appeared from hallways and adjacent spaces with the quiet speed of people who had been waiting for exactly this instruction. Bags and cases and equipment being consolidated, the house shifting from base of operations to abandoned position in a matter of minutes. Celine was gathering the documents back into the bag with the same precision she'd used to take them out. Evelyn stood. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere Victor doesn't have a location for, Roman said. He was pulling on his coat, phone already in hand. We have a facility 40 miles north, medical grade. It's where Kaz went. Will it hold? He looked at her, didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. We have to move, he said instead. She was moving, Carla appearing at her elbow with her coat and the one bag she had, and around her the house was being stripped of anything useful. Laptops closed, papers burned in the kitchen sink, the small, purposeful destruction of a team that understood what it meant to leave no information behind. They were 3 minutes from ready when the man at the front window said one word. Convoy? Not theirs. Evelyn heard the engines before she reached the window. Multiple vehicles, heavy, moving fast down the access road from the main gate. Not the kind of approach that suggested negotiation. Roman's man, the one who'd shown her the laptop, looked at Roman with a question he didn't put into words. Roman said, How many? 6 vehicles, maybe 8. Victor moved faster than his own timeline, Celine said from behind them, and there was something in her voice that Evelyn had not expected. Not fear exactly, but the specific tone of someone understanding that a miscalculation they made has just become a room they have to live in. Roman turned to Evelyn. She saw it on his face before he said it. The particular quality of a man who has run the numbers and doesn't like the result and is about to tell the truth about it regardless. We can't all get out, he said, not through the main road. They'll close the south access in the next 4 minutes. Then what? There's a vehicle in the rear garage. 1 driver, 1 passenger, small enough to go through the east utility access while they're focused on the main approach. He looked at her steadily. You and Celine. Celine knows the north facility. She takes you there. She understood what he was proposing. And you. Buy time. That's not Evelyn. Again, that specific quality of her name in his voice, that precise placement of it. The documents go with Celine, right? You go with the documents. That's the only version of this that works. She looked at the window where the approaching lights were already visible through the tree line. 6 sets of headlights moving with the coordinated purpose of a force that had been briefed on exactly what it was driving into. She looked at Roman. He was already looking at the window. She wanted to say something that mattered. She had the vocabulary for it and the intelligence for it, and she had spent 6 years in a marriage that had systematically stripped both of those things of their value. A marriage where the right words had always been received as the wrong kind of power. And standing here in a house that was about to become a firefight, she found that what she wanted to say had nothing to do with strategy or gratitude or even fear. She said, "Don't get killed." He looked at her. "I'll do what I can," he said. Carla took her arm. Celine was already moving toward the rear of the house. Evelyn went with them, through the kitchen and down a back hall and into a garage that smelled of motor oil and cold concrete, where a dark sedan sat running, a man she didn't know in the driver's seat. She got in. The garage door opened to the rear of the property, to a narrow utility track through the tree line that she hadn't known existed and that was barely wide enough for the car. The driver went without headlights, slowly, guided by some combination of memory and the thin gray light that morning had produced. In the back seat, Evelyn held Celine's bag on her lap with both hands and listened to the sounds behind them. Voices, then engines, then the first sound of impact that she recognized as a vehicle ramming something at speed. And she did not look back. The tree line closed around them. The main house disappeared. She sat in the dark moving car with the documents that could end Victor Mercer on her lap, and her daughter pressing steadily against her ribs, and the sound of the fight she'd left behind getting smaller with distance. And she let herself look at one thing she hadn't looked at directly yet. The possibility that Roman had given her the only working exit because it was the only working exit, which meant he had nothing left but to hold the position and hope the math was survivable. The car emerged from the utility track onto a county road that was empty in both directions. The driver turned north without asking. Celine sat next to her with her hands in her lap and her face doing nothing. And then, quietly, she said, "He's done this before." Held a position. "I know," Evelyn said. She didn't know. But she said it anyway, because the alternative was sitting with what she didn't know, and that was a space she couldn't afford to fall into right now. Her phone, Roman's man had given her a burner before they left, sliding it into her coat pocket without ceremony, buzzed once. A single text from a number she didn't have saved. It said, "Rhodes, call her. Use this number. Tell her Celine is with you." And then, after a pause that must have been the seconds between one situation and the next, a second message. It said, "Don't come back for me." She read it twice. Then she looked out at the empty county road running north through the white, flat Illinois morning and understood that whatever Roman had been protecting himself from, by keeping her at distance, by keeping his voice even and his answers limited and his face controlled, he had just stopped protecting it. He had sent her the number. He had told her to run, and then told her not to come back, which was not what a man said when he believed he was going to be fine, and she sat with that understanding moving through her like cold water. And then she did what he couldn't have expected. She called the number. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, sharp, no preamble, the voice of someone who picked up phones at bad hours as a professional habit. "Rhodes." "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said. "I have Celine. I have the documents. And the man who just handed me your number is about to be overrun by Victor Mercer's people at a private estate 40 miles south of the city." A pause. Short. "Address, Dietz," Rhodes said. Evelyn gave it. Another pause, longer, the sound of movement on the other end, of a room shifting gears. Then, "Stay on the line." And Evelyn stayed on the line, in a dark car moving north through the flat white Illinois morning, with everything that mattered to her either in her arms or 40 miles behind her. And for the first time since Grant had put her on that road, she was not waiting for someone to make a decision. She had made one. And she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had just burned the last available version of playing it safe, that there was no shape of this that brought her back to who she'd been before last night. No version where she got to stand in a room and be the person who hadn't done what she'd just done. And the thing that surprised her, the thing she noticed in her own chest as the car moved north and the phone stayed live in her hand, was that she was not afraid of... That was not afraid. She held on to that. In the back seat of a dark car moving north through the flat white Illinois morning, phone pressed to her ear, and Celine's bag locked under both hands, and her daughter pushing steady against her ribs. She held on to the absence of fear the way you hold on to something warm when the cold is still everywhere else. Not because she wasn't in danger. She was in more danger than she'd ever been in her life. But fear was a thing that happened to her when she was passive, when she was waiting for someone else to determine the shape of what came next, and she had just stopped doing that. Rhodes was still on the line. In the background, Evelyn could hear the Chicago field office assembling itself. Voices, the particular controlled urgency of a federal operation going from standby to active, the sounds of a machine that had been built for exactly this kind of acceleration and was finally being permitted to use it. "How many of his people are at the estate?" Rhodes asked. "6 vehicles minimum when I left. That was 20 minutes ago. And Viscari's inside." "As far as I know." A pause. "Ms. Hart, I need you to understand something. Viscari is not a protected party in this operation. If he's taken in the response—" "I understand that," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you to get there before that becomes the only outcome." Another pause. Shorter. "We're moving." The line didn't close. Rhodes kept her on it, not talking, just present, the phone live between them like a thread. Evelyn sat with it against her ear and watched the flat landscape moving past the window and did not look at Celine, and did not look at the bag, and did not let herself calculate what was happening 40 miles south in any detail, because detail was where the fear lived, and she had decided not to live there. The North facility was a converted medical building set back from a secondary road behind a chain-link fence that looked abandoned and wasn't. The driver stopped at a gate that opened from the inside before he reached it, which meant someone had been watching the road, and Evelyn filed that away as evidence that Roman's organization had more infrastructure than its visible surface suggested. Inside, Kaz was on a table with his left arm being worked on by a woman in surgical gloves who didn't look up when they came in. 2 other men Evelyn hadn't seen before stood at the far end of the room with the alert stillness of people on a perimeter. The space was clean and cold, and smelled of antiseptic and something electrical, like equipment that had been running for a long time. Carla appeared from a side room. She looked at Evelyn, looked at Celine, looked at the phone in Evelyn's hand. "You called Rhodes," she said. "Yes." Something moved across Carla's face, not disapproval, not quite. More like the expression of a woman who had managed consequences for a long time and was already calculating this one. "Roman told you not to surface yet." "Roman told me not to come back for him," Evelyn said. "Those aren't the same instruction." Carla looked at her for a long moment. Then she exhaled through her nose and turned away, which Evelyn read as the closest thing to agreement she was going to get. She sat down. Her back had moved past the grinding stage into something deeper and more insistent, a pressure that radiated from her lower spine through her hips, and she recognized it as different from the chronic pregnancy ache, different in quality, if not yet in frequency. She pressed her hands against the sides of her stomach and breathed. Celine sat across from her and opened the bag and spread the documents on the table and began separating them into sequences with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that organization was a form of protection, that a document that couldn't be found quickly was a document that might as well not exist. "Rhodes will need these in a specific order," Celine said without looking up. "The fraud structure first, then the trust channel, then the account movements from the last 8 months. That's where Grant's direct involvement is clearest." "Grant is an accessory," Evelyn said. "Knowing and compliant, but not the architect." "Correct. But knowing and compliant is still 15 to 20 years depending on the prosecutor's mood." Celine placed a folder to the left. "Victor faces RICO, wire fraud, obstruction, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder if Rhodes can connect the Hale killing. That's not a trial. That's a negotiation about whether he dies in a federal facility or outside one." Evelyn looked at the documents on the table. 30 years of a man's choices, organized into folders by a woman who had spent 11 years close enough to him to understand exactly how he'd made them. "Why did you work for him?" she asked. "For that long." Celine didn't stop organizing. "Because I was 28, and he offered me a job that didn't exist anywhere legitimate, doing work that was genuinely complex, for money I couldn't have reached any other way." She placed another folder. "And then 10 years passed." "When did you know?" "I always knew. What changed was caring." She looked up briefly. "I started caring when he had a man killed who reminded me of my father. That's not a sophisticated reason. It's just the true one." Evelyn held her gaze for a moment, nodded. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from Rhodes. 2 words. We're in. She read it twice. Then she looked at the time. 43 minutes since she'd given the address. Federal response, 40 miles out in 43 minutes, meant Rhodes had been pre-positioning before Evelyn called, which meant Rhodes had been closer to moving than she'd admitted, which meant Hale's filing had already done more work than anyone had told her. She thought about Duncan Hale. She thought about him filing that report 3 weeks before he died, knowing or suspecting what it might cost him, sending the copy anyway, and she thought about what it meant that a man could do that, understand the risk, measure it clearly, and move forward regardless. And she thought about how she had spent 2 years in a house with a man who had moved in the opposite direction at every possible choice point, and she thought about her daughter. She was going to tell her daughter about Duncan Hale someday. She was going to tell her that some people, when they understand the cost of the right thing, pay it. The next text from Rhodes came 9 minutes later and said, Viscari is alive. Detained. Victor Mercer's people fled the estate. We're tracking 3 vehicles. Victor himself was not on site. Evelyn read it and felt the bottom drop out of something. Not on site. Victor had sent his people and stayed clear. Of course he had. 30 years of building a system where his name appeared nowhere in the direct chain. He didn't change methods under pressure. He refined them. He'd known the estate was compromised the moment Celine was followed. He'd sent the convoy to recover the documents and eliminate witnesses, and he had been nowhere near any of it. She looked at Celine. Victor wasn't at the estate. Celine's hand stopped moving. Just for a second. No, she said quietly. He wouldn't be. Where would he go? Celine set down the folder she was holding, looked at the table. Evelyn watched her running something behind her eyes, a calculation or a memory or both. There's a property, Celine said, on Lake Delton. It's registered to a company that's registered to a company. I've never seen it in any of the documents because Victor kept it completely separate from the organization's structure. He used it twice while I worked for him. Once when a federal probe came close in 2017, once when a partner became a liability. She paused. He called it the Winter House. I don't know if that's a name or just what he called it. Could he destroy documents there? If he had copies of anything that links him directly, yes. That's why he'd go. Celine looked up. He has maybe a 6-hour window before the account freeze catches up to him. After that, the money stops moving and the paper trail is fixed. If he destroys his copies before then and the freeze lands on accounts that look clean, he survives it, Evelyn said. He narrows the case significantly, yes. Evelyn called Rhodes. 1 ring. I need to tell you about a property on Lake Delton, she said. Silence on the other end. The specific silence of someone writing. She gave every detail Celine provided. The company chain, the approximate location Celine remembered from a map she'd seen once on Victor's desk, the fact that he'd used it as a disappearing point before. She spoke clearly and quickly and didn't qualify any of it with uncertainty she wasn't sure she had. When she finished, Rhodes said, How solid is the source on this? The source built his financial system for 11 years and has 30 years of documented evidence in front of her right now. Another silence. Then, I need the documents, Ms. Hart. Now. Not through channels. I need them in my hands. My partner and I are 20 minutes from your location if you give it to me. Evelyn looked at Celine. Celine said, Yes. She gave Rhodes the address. Then she put the phone down on the table and sat with her hands flat on either side of it and breathed through the pressure in her back that was getting harder to distinguish from something with a different name. Carla was watching her from across the room. How far apart? Carla asked. What? The pressure. How far apart? Evelyn looked at her. It's not contractions. It's my back. How far apart? Carla said again. She thought about the last 2 hours. The pressure came and went. She'd registered it as stress response, as the physical toll of fear and cold and movement. But Carla was looking at her with the eyes of someone who had seen something she recognized and was not going to be redirected. Maybe 15 minutes, Evelyn said quietly. Carla turned to the woman who'd been working on Kaz's arm, who had finished and was cleaning up. They exchanged a look. You need to lie down, Carla said. Rhodes is 20 minutes out. I need to be here when... You can be here lying down. Carla moved toward her. The baby doesn't care about Victor Mercer's schedule. The next contraction hit while Carla was helping her to the cot in the side room, and it was not like the pressure had been. It was specific and building and very clear about what it was, and Evelyn lay on her side with her eyes open and her hand on her stomach and thought, "Not now. Please, not yet. Give me enough time to finish this." And her daughter did not appear to be negotiating. She heard Rhodes arrive, heard the voices in the main room, the new energy of federal presence. Celine's voice clipped and organized as she began walking someone through the documents. She heard her own name once, Rhodes asking where she was, and Carla's response, and then footsteps, and Rhodes appeared in the doorway of the side room. She was 40, maybe 42, with short natural hair and the face of someone who had spent years in rooms where people lied to her and had developed a particular patience with it. She looked at Evelyn on the cot, and her expression did what Evelyn had learned to read in the last 12 hours, as the mark of a person who was actually doing their job. It prioritized what was in front of it. "Are you in labor?" Rhodes asked. "Possibly," Evelyn said. "I need 10 minutes. "I need 5, Rhodes said, and pulled a chair from nowhere and sat beside the cot with a recorder and a notepad and the focused presence of a woman who understood that the next few minutes had a specific value that would not recur. Evelyn gave her the 5 minutes. She started from the beginning. The library. Marcus at the door. Grant's voice through the intercom. The road. The cold. Every name she knew, every account detail Roman's man had shown her, the inheritance clause, Petra, Hale's meeting, the 8-month timeline. She spoke in the clipped, declarative sentences of someone giving testimony rather than telling a story, and Rhodes wrote and recorded and asked 3 questions, sharp and specific, and Evelyn answered all 3. Then a contraction hit that was longer and harder than the ones before it, and Rhodes stood and said, "Okay, that's enough. Victor, we're moving on the Lake Delton property right now. My partner's already coordinating." Rhodes looked at her steadily. "You did what you needed to do, Ms. Hart. Let us do the rest." She wanted to argue. The part of her that had called Rhodes from a moving car while being told not to, the part that had looked at the math of what Grant had done and refused to treat it as something happening to her rather than something she could act on, that part was not done. But her daughter had a different opinion about timing, and her daughter was making it very clearly known. Carla came back in. Rhodes stepped out. The woman who'd worked on Kaz set up equipment with quiet speed, and the room reorganized itself around a different emergency, and Evelyn lay on the cot in a medical facility 40 miles north of Chicago and focused on breathing. While outside the room, the documents that were going to end Victor Mercer were being loaded into a federal vehicle, and the operation that Duncan Hale had died to start was finally running the way it should have run 3 weeks ago. Her phone was on the cot beside her. She picked it up. She typed one message to the number Roman had used. She didn't know if he still had his phone. She didn't know what condition he was in. She typed it anyway because the alternative was not sending it, and she had decided, somewhere on that county road moving north, that she was done making the choice not to say things. She typed, "Rhodes has everything. Victor's location sent. You can stop holding now." She put the phone down. Another contraction. She breathed through it. When it was done, she was sweating, and her vision had that bright, focused quality that she recognized from nothing she'd experienced before but understood completely. The body narrowing to its essential task, everything peripheral dropping away. Carla's hand was on her arm. Steady. Present. "You did good," Carla said. Evelyn didn't answer. She was looking at the ceiling and thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously. Victor at a lake house burning paper. Rhodes's partner cutting through the Illinois morning with a convoy of federal vehicles. Roman detained somewhere at the estate or already moving or something else she couldn't know yet. And underneath all of it, present and insistent and getting louder, the reality that her daughter was coming whether the rest of it was finished or not. Her phone lit up. She picked it up with a hand that was shaking from effort rather than fear. The message was from Roman's number. 2 words. Held. Then, 3 seconds later, a 3rd word. Coming. She put the phone against her chest and closed her eyes. Outside the room, she could hear Celine's voice, precise and relentless, walking a federal agent through 30 years of organized crime with the patience of someone who had been waiting 11 years to say it out loud. She could hear the facility's equipment running. She could hear the wind against the building's exterior. The winter not finished yet, but no longer the thing that was going to kill her. The next contraction was the hardest yet, and when it peaked, she made a sound she didn't try to control, and Carla's hand was still on her arm, and the woman working beside her said something calm and technical that Evelyn didn't process but found grounding anyway. And she held on to the edge of the cot with both hands and thought about being on that road last night, about falling to her knees in the snow and looking up at headlights and not knowing what was coming toward her. She had gotten up. She needed to keep doing that. Through the wall, faintly, she heard Rhodes' voice on a phone, raised slightly, the controlled elevation of someone receiving information that required immediate response, and then the sound of movement, fast, toward the exit, and she thought, Lake Delton. She thought, find him before he burns it. She thought, it has to be enough, what we sent them. It has to be enough because I am out of capacity to make it more than it is right now, and my daughter is... Her daughter was coming. That was the only true thing in the room. Everything else, Victor Mercer and his lake house, and the documents and the federal convoy cutting through the Illinois morning, had moved to the far edge of what she could hold. Her body had narrowed to a single point and was asking everything of her, and she gave it because there was nothing else available to give. Carla stayed at her left side the entire time, not speaking much, just present in the way certain people know how to be present, without commentary, without performance, without the particular cruelty of telling a woman in extremity that she was doing well when doing well had nothing to do with it. The medical woman, her name was Dara, Evelyn learned it between contractions, worked with a focused quiet that was its own form of reassurance. Equipment, preparation. The room organized around its purpose. 3 hours and 40 minutes. That was how long it took. They were not easy hours. She didn't expect them to be. Pain had a quality she hadn't understood from the outside, not simply intense but total, consuming the body's entire attention the way a fire consumes oxygen, leaving nothing spare for anything else. She held the edge of the cot. She breathed the way Dara told her to breathe. She did not think about Victor or Roman or the lake house or whether Rhodes had gotten there in time, because there was genuinely no capacity for it, the body having claimed everything. At 1:14 in the afternoon, her daughter was born. The sound she made, small and furious and undeniable, the sound of something that had not existed in the world and now did and intended to be known about, was the loudest thing Evelyn had ever heard, which made no sense because it was objectively not loud, but it filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Evelyn held her. She was red-faced and wrinkled and approximately the most complete thing Evelyn had ever seen, and she was crying in the particular way of newborns that is less distress than announcement, and Evelyn held her against her chest and looked at her face and said nothing at all for a long time, because there were no words that were anywhere near the size of what she was looking at. Carla was crying. She did it the way she did everything, without drawing attention to it, turned slightly away, one hand over her mouth. Dara was not crying, being professional, but her eyes were doing something her face was working to manage. After a while, Evelyn said, "She's okay?" "Perfect," Dara said. "Healthy? A little early, but not dangerously." "She knew what she was doing," Carla said, and her voice was rough in a way Evelyn had not heard from her before. "Coming when the worst was over." Evelyn looked at her daughter's face, the face of someone who had no idea what the last 24 hours had been and would never fully know, who had been on that road in the blizzard and in the back seat of a black SUV and in a house under fire and in a car moving north through the white flat morning, and through all of it had simply continued to exist, insisting on it, pushing back against Evelyn's palm every time she needed to be reminded that there was something worth moving toward. "Clara," she said. She hadn't decided the name. She'd had a list, discussed with nobody since Grant had shown no interest in the actual process of preparing for a child, only in the social performance of expecting one. Clara had not been on the list. It arrived complete and certain, and she said it once more to be sure. "Clara." Her daughter did not object. She was still holding Clara, still learning the weight and heat of her, when her phone buzzed on the cot beside her. She reached for it one-handed. Roman. One word, outside. She looked at Carla. Carla said, "He came in an hour ago. I told him to wait." "You could have told me." "You were busy," Carla said, without apology. She thought about asking someone to bring him in. She thought about the message he'd sent. Coming. And the one before it. Held. And what the space between those two words had contained, what had happened to him in the time between the estate and this facility that she didn't know yet. She thought about what it meant that he was outside and waiting, that he had not simply come in, that he was a man who had sent her away in order to protect her, and then received her message and come anyway, and was now standing outside a door giving her the choice. "Help me sit up," she said. Carla helped her sit up. Dara adjusted the arrangement of blankets and equipment with efficient care. Evelyn settled Clara against her chest and nodded toward the door. Carla opened it. Roman stood in the frame looking worse than she'd seen him, which was saying something given that she'd first seen him in a blizzard in the middle of the night. He had a cut above his right eye that had been closed with a butterfly bandage. Field work, not hospital. And his coat was gone, his shirt torn at the left shoulder where the fabric had been cut and something applied beneath. He was moving with a careful deliberateness that suggested at least one rib making its opinion known. He looked at her. He looked at Clara. She watched something happen in his face that he didn't try to prevent. That was what she noticed most. That he didn't manage it, didn't pull the expression back into the controlled register he used for everything else. He just stood there in the doorway and let his face do what it did. And what it did was complicated and complete, and she understood it without needing him to explain any of it. He came in slowly, stopped at the cot's edge, looked at the child against her chest. "She's here," he said. His voice was different, not unsteady. That wasn't quite the word, just closer to something. "She's here," Evelyn said. He reached out one hand slowly and let Clara's fingers close around his index finger with the indiscriminate grip of newborns who haven't learned yet to be selective about what they hold on to. He looked at the grip, looked at Clara's face, said nothing for a while, then, "Victor's in federal custody," she exhaled. "Rhodes got there 20 minutes before he finished burning what he had. He'd destroyed maybe a third of his copies." His voice had returned to its working register. Still different in some quality she couldn't name, but functional. The remaining 2/3, combined with what Celine brought, is apparently sufficient. Rhodes used the word comprehensive. And the accounts? Frozen as of 11 this morning. 47 accounts across 9 entities. The 2 men who ran the shooting on the estate were picked up on the I-90 at noon. A pause. Grant turned himself in, 2 hours ago. His attorney made a deal before the arrests caught up to him. She absorbed this. He'll cooperate against Victor. He'll testify to everything he knows, which includes the instruction to put you on that road and the original plan for what was supposed to happen after. Roman's jaw tightened. He's going to try to minimize his role. He won't succeed. "No," she agreed. "He won't." She looked at Clara. The specific arithmetic of what Grant had been willing to do, willing to leave her in a blizzard, willing to let her and this child die in the snow on a private road, sat in her chest the way things sat when they were too large and too true to be processed quickly. She didn't try to process it quickly. She let it be there, occupying the space it occupied, and looked at her daughter's face and understood that the price of Clara's life had been the complete demolition of the life she'd thought she was living, and that there was no version where you called that a fair trade, and also no version where she would have chosen differently. She looked up at Roman. "You're hurt," she said. "Manageable." That's what people say when they don't want to explain how hurt they are. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. 2 ribs, the cut, a shoulder that's been worse. He paused. "I've been worse." "I don't doubt it." A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that accumulates between people who have been through something together that didn't have a name before it happened and still doesn't quite have one. She said, "You told me not to come back for you." "I did." "I didn't come back. I called Rhodes instead." "I know. Was that the right call?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It was the right call." "You could say so with slightly more enthusiasm." "I could," he agreed, and the thing at the corner of his mouth became more defined. Not quite a smile. The same thing she'd been reading at the corner of his expression since the blizzard. Something that had learned to stop short of smiling a long time ago and hadn't been given sufficient reason to unlearn it until recently. Clara made a sound, not crying, something smaller, the sound of a person adjusting to the strangeness of existing outside the place they'd spent 8 months. Roman looked at her. The expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd seen it. "She's strong," he said, quietly, not performing it. "She had to be," Evelyn said. "She comes from a long line of women who didn't have the option of not being strong." He looked at her then, and the look had something in it she hadn't seen directed at her before, not from anyone, not in a long time. Not attraction, or not only that, something more durable than attraction. The look of a man who had watched a woman make a series of decisions under the worst possible conditions and had updated everything he'd previously understood about what people were capable of. She felt it land, and didn't look away, and didn't fill the space with words. The days that followed had a quality she hadn't expected. Slowness. Not the slowness of stasis or recovery in the passive sense, but the slowness of things that had been moving too fast for too long finally finding their actual speed. Rhodes came to the facility the next day, sat across from her with a recorder and 4 hours of questions, and Evelyn answered all of them with the same precision she'd used on the phone, and at the end Rhodes closed her notepad and said, "You're going to be called as a witness. You know that." "I know." "It's going to be public." "Good," Evelyn said. Rhodes looked at her, seemed to be evaluating something. "Most people in your position want to stay private after something like this." "Most people in my position didn't watch a man they trusted build a system to kill them and their child," Evelyn said. "I want it public. I want every name on those documents said out loud in a federal courthouse, and I want a record that says what they did and what it cost." Rhodes nodded. She stood, picked up her recorder, then paused at the door. "Hale's filing," she said. "It was what moved us to pre-position. We'd been sitting on a closed investigation for 8 months. No documents, no corroborating witness, nothing we could bring to a grand jury. When his filing came in, my supervisor wanted to treat it as inconclusive pending review." She paused. "I didn't wait for the review." Evelyn looked at her. "He would have wanted to know that," she said. "Yeah," Rhodes said. "I think he would have." She left. Celine came the morning after with a clean copy of the document set and a chain of custody records she'd prepared overnight, organized for federal evidence protocol with the same precision she'd applied to everything. She set it on the table beside the cot where Evelyn was sitting with Clara and stood with her hands at her sides, looking at the child with an expression that was difficult to categorize. "She's going to be fine," Celine said. "In case you were still asking that question." "I'm always asking that question," Evelyn said. "I think that's the job from here." Celine was quiet for a moment. "What will you do after?" "There's an apartment in Evanston I can stay in. My sister." She looked at Clara. "After that? I don't know yet. The trust will go through a state review as part of the federal case. Whatever comes out the other side belongs to her." She adjusted the blanket. "I'm a lawyer. I'll figure out what to do with a clean inheritance." "You were a lawyer," Celine said. "I'm still a lawyer. I haven't practiced in 2 years because I made accommodations for a marriage that was architecture." She said it without bitterness, just as a thing that was true and correctable. "I'll correct it." Celine looked at her for a moment and then did something Evelyn hadn't seen from her. She smiled. Brief, contained, but real. "Yes," she said. "I think you will." She left the documents and left. Victor Mercer was arraigned 11 days later. Evelyn didn't watch the coverage. She heard about it from Diane, who arrived at the facility 2 days after Clara was born, and who cried in the doorway for a long moment and then pulled herself together and came in and held her niece with the careful reverence of someone touching something precious, and who slept in a chair beside the cot that first night without being asked. Diane told her about the arraignment the way she told Evelyn everything, directly, with commentary, without softening it to the point of uselessness. "He looked small," she said. "That's the thing about men like that. You expect them to look like what they are in a courtroom. He just looked old and small." "He is old and small," Evelyn said. "The size of a thing isn't what makes it dangerous." "Grant looked worse," Diane said. "He looked like a man who understood for the first time that the rest of his life has a shape he didn't choose. Evelyn nursed Clara and said nothing. "Do you feel anything?" Diane asked. Not with judgment, just with the honest curiosity of a sister who had watched her choose and wasn't sure what choosing cost her. She thought about it genuinely. "I feel like I'm tired," she said. "In a way that isn't the baby. A kind of tired that goes all the way back to the first time I understood that my marriage was a performance I was the only one actually committed to." She paused. "I don't feel what I thought I'd feel. I thought I'd feel larger, more settled. But it's quiet, like the absence of something that was very loud." Diane nodded. "That's what the end of fear feels like," she said. "You forget it was always making noise." Roman came back on the fourth day. He came in the late afternoon when the light through the facility's small windows was the kind of pale winter gold that suggested the season was still itself. But remembering spring existed. He looked better. The cut healing, the careful deliberateness of his movement reduced but still present. He wore a different coat. He brought nothing. He sat in the chair Diane had vacated an hour earlier and looked at Clara, who was sleeping in the small portable bassinet Dara had produced from somewhere. And he looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the doorway, without management. Evelyn watched him looking. "What happens to you?" she said. "Now." He considered the question without deflecting it, which she'd come to understand was one of his actual characteristics, rather than a situational response. "Rhodes has what she needs on Victor and the consortium. What she has on me is less useful than she might prefer." He looked at the bassinet. "My attorney and her office will reach an accommodation." "That's a careful way to say it." "It's an accurate way to say it." He looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend I come out of this clean. I don't come out of anything clean. That's not what my life is." She held his gaze. "I know what your life is." "Do you?" "I know enough." She looked at Clara, then back at him. "I know you stopped on a road in a blizzard when you didn't have to. I know you put 2 men at my door. I know you gave me the exit when the alternative was better for you strategically." She paused. "And I know you came back here." He was quiet. "Why did you come back?" she asked. He looked at Clara for a moment, then at her. And he said it the way he said the things that cost him something, plainly, without framing, with no architecture around it to make it easier to retract. "Because I wanted to see her," he said. "And I wanted to see you." A pause. "And I didn't want either of those things from the other side of a drive that I kept finding reasons to make." She sat with that. "I'm going to Diane's in Evanston," she said. "When I'm cleared to travel, I need to be somewhere that's mine. Clara needs to be somewhere without a perimeter." "I know." "I'm not saying that as a rejection." He looked at her, the something at the corner of his mouth. "I know that too," he said. She reached over and handed him Clara. He took her with the careful deliberateness of a man who had never held an infant and knew it and was not going to perform confidence he didn't have. He settled her against his left arm, the unbothered shoulder, and looked at her face with an expression that was entirely undefended, and Clara slept through all of it, being too new to understand what it meant and too certain to care. They sat like that for a while in the fading afternoon light, not talking, not needing to. Outside, the winter was doing what Illinois winters eventually did, losing ground by degrees, the cold still present, but the light changing in ways you could feel before you could see. In a federal building downtown, Victor Mercer's arraignment had generated 22 co-defendants and a RICO indictment that the Tribune's legal correspondent described as the most comprehensive financial crime case in the city's modern history. 42 names, 30 years, pension funds, municipal contracts, a family trust belonging to a schoolteacher who hadn't known, and 2 lives she'd tried to end before they could dismantle what she'd built. All of it public, all of it on record, exactly as Evelyn had wanted. Grant Mercer accepted a cooperation agreement that reduced his sentence but did not eliminate it. He would spend 7 years in a federal minimum security facility in Indiana, which was less than he deserved and more than he'd expected when his attorney first negotiated, and which Evelyn did not think about very often because thinking about it was not a useful way to spend the energy she had, and energy was something she was learning to allocate differently. Petra was charged as an accessory. She pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence and gave a statement that corroborated every detail of the timeline. Evelyn read the statement once and did not read it again. Celine entered a formal cooperation agreement with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit and spent 8 months working with Rhodes's team as a consultant on the evidence organization. After that, she moved to a different city, which Evelyn heard about through a brief message she received 6 months later that said only, Portland. It's raining. The work is honest. Evelyn wrote back, good, and meant it fully. Kaz kept his arm. Carla remained at the North facility, managing whatever the facility managed, and sent Evelyn a card when Clara turned 3 months old that contained no sentiment and one dry observation about the child's evident stubbornness, which Evelyn kept on the refrigerator in Diane's apartment for a long time. In April, 6 weeks after leaving the facility, Evelyn stood on the small deck outside Diane's apartment in the early morning before Clara woke. The air was cold still, but differently cold. The cold of a season that had peaked and was withdrawing, leaving room for something else. The lake was visible from the deck if you stood at the right angle, flat and gray-blue and very still. She heard the door behind her. Roman stood in the frame with 2 cups of coffee, which was not a thing she'd arranged or expected, and yet was not surprising. He had appeared at the apartment twice in the preceding weeks, each time with a reason that was technically valid and a quality of presence that suggested the reason was secondary, and Diane had received him with the specific neutrality of a woman who had opinions she was choosing not to deploy. He handed her a cup. She took it. They stood on the deck and looked at the lake. Rhodes called me yesterday, she said. About the trial date? About a position. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She's working with the U.S. Attorney's Office on a financial crimes task force. They want someone with background in trust law and estate structure who understands the kind of architecture Victor used. She paused. She thought of me. He was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it. And? She looked at the lake. I think I'm going to do it. She felt him nod, or sensed it. They were close enough that she could register the small shift of his weight. That's the right answer, he said. It'll put me in a federal building 4 days a week, which has certain implications for the accommodation you're making with Rhodes's office. My attorney is good, he said. The accommodation is durable. She looked at him. He was looking at the lake with the contained expression she'd spent weeks learning to read underneath. And underneath it now, she saw the thing she'd first glimpsed when he'd stood in the doorway with Clara. The particular unguardedness of a man who had decided, without announcing the decision, to stop managing the distance between himself and something he hadn't planned for. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. Some things between people didn't need to be said to be real. They just needed to be standing in the same direction. Clara woke. The sound of her, starting small and building, the morning announcement of a person who had been awake and quiet for exactly as long as she intended to be, came through the glass door with the insistence that Evelyn had already learned to read like a language, which need, which volume meant which state of being. She turned toward the door. Roman was already turning. She let him go in first. She stood on the deck alone for a moment with her coffee and the lake and the pale April morning, and she listened to Roman's voice through the glass, low, slightly clumsy with the unfamiliarity of it, saying something to a 3-month-old who couldn't understand words but could understand the quality of attention, and hearing that quality and going quiet. She looked at the water. She thought about the road in the blizzard, the specific terrible clarity of it, the cold, the dark, the understanding that she had been brought to that place by a series of choices other people had made, and that she had trusted when she should have looked harder. She did not think about it with bitterness, because bitterness was a form of staying in the place, and she had made a different choice. She thought about it the way you think about a road you survived, acknowledging it, knowing where it fits in the map of what made you, and then looking at where you're standing instead. She was standing on a deck in April. Her daughter was inside with a man who had driven through a blizzard for reasons he hadn't finished understanding, and who held an infant with careful, imperfect attention, and who would continue, she thought, to drive that direction. Not because he had changed fundamentally. Men like Roman didn't change fundamentally, and she didn't need him to. He was what he was, as she was what she was. But people moved within what they were. They expanded into spaces they hadn't previously occupied. They put 2 men at doors, and gave away the exits and came back anyway, and eventually stopped finding reasons to delay the drive. She finished her coffee. She went inside. Clara was on Roman's chest, having decided that the clumsiness of his hold was not a sufficient objection to the warmth of it, and he was standing in the middle of Diane's small living room with a look on his face that was so entirely without performance that Evelyn stopped for a second in the doorway just to see it. This hard, careful man standing in an ordinary room holding an ordinary small child and looking at her like she was a fact he'd never encountered before and couldn't classify and had stopped trying to. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at Clara, who looked back at both of them with the wide, dark, unfocused gaze of someone absorbing the world without judgment yet, storing all of it, building the archive of what existed. "She's going to ask questions," Roman said, "when she's older." "Yes," Evelyn agreed, "about all of it." "Yes." "What will you tell her?" She looked at her daughter, thought about the road and the cold, and the man who stepped out of the dark, and the woman who got off her knees, and the documents that had dismantled 30 years of constructed invulnerability, and the attorney who had died to start it, and the woman who had carried the proof for 11 years waiting for the guarantee, and the federal agent who hadn't waited for authorization, and a newborn who had arrived 3 weeks early into the middle of all of it and simply insisted on being present. "I'll tell her that people tried to erase us," she said, "and that we didn't let them, and that the people who helped us paid real prices to do it." She looked at Roman, "and that the world is full of men who build things to protect themselves from consequences, and that consequences come anyway. That's the truth she should know." He looked at her. "And the other part," he said quietly, "the part where you were on the road." She held his gaze. "I'll tell her that too. When she's old enough to understand that surviving is not the same as being unharmed, and that moving forward is not the same as being unafraid." She paused. "And that sometimes the thing that saves you comes from a direction you didn't expect, and you get to choose what you do about that." Clara made a sound. Not distress, the small adjusting sound of a person getting comfortable. Outside, the lake was the same flat gray blue it had been, and the April morning was doing what April mornings did, pressing at the edges of winter with patient insistence, not fighting it, just persisting, the way things persisted that had decided they were going to. The city was out there, the same city, carrying its history the way cities carried histories, in its buildings and its courthouses and its obituaries and its indictments, in the names on the dockets that had 30 years of other names underneath them. All of it out there, all of it behind her. She was here. Clara was here. And in this small, warm room on an April morning with the worst of it over and the rest of it beginning, that was exactly enough.